Chapter 15, A Little Black Lady. On down the corridor they marched, the dog behind, the soldiers in front, their little feet tip-tapping on the stone floors. All along the walls, swords and guns were mounted on display. "OK, we land on a planet," said Charlie, "lost in time. We've arrived in a different era, but we have modern technology." "God's wounds," says the old man, looking at my laser ray gun. "I would fain wield such a machine, i' faith." "Yea," I say, "but I have a laser gun and an H-bomb, and you have a club and boots. Hard cheese, buddy." And I dematerialise him. "I'm sorry I didn't help you find your name," said Frank to Notsheba. "Oh, that's okay," she said. "I didn't get on very well with your worksheet." "Yeah," said Frank, "I'm probably for the scrap heap." "The scrap heap's probably paradise compared to where I'm going." Said Frank, looking down at the toy soldiers marching on ahead. They were singing their Indian song. Their grape-sheet shell and musketry they found but little good, when British soldiers were outside a-thirsting for their blood. "You're only toy soldiers, you know," shouted Frank. "You're not real. You're made of, What are they made of?" said Frank. "I don't know," said Notsheba. "I'll dematerialise them," said Charlie. "What are you made of?" shouted Frank to the soldiers. One of them called back to him over the singing. "Lead." "What does that make you think of?" said Frank to Notsheba, expecting her to say the dolphin. "Little Moppet," said Notsheba. "Little Moppet? What's she got to do with it?" "What she said about little Arnold and that thing about his hand." And Charlie added helpfully, "You remember? Little Arnold Schwarzenegger." Yes, said Frank to both of them. By now they had reached two large double doors. "Wait here until you're called," said the dog, and it pushed past them and through the doors. "We face the intergalactic overlord with calm determination," said Charlie, and he added anxiously, "You don't think all this intergalactic stuff was done to death with Toy Story, do you? I mean, I really worry sometimes that I sound so last year, yeah?" Then just a moment later, the doors were flung open and the dog led three prisoners into a large courtroom. The judge's chair was empty, but in front of it, on a table, stood Hanuman and Sita. In front of that, at a desk, sat Mrs. Morell, Frank's teacher. On the benches sat Miss Charlotte and Master William, Father Abbott, the Dolphin, and many more toy soldiers. Miss Charlotte and Master William waved at Notsheba. She looked at them, at first with surprise, and then turned her head away. Frank looked at her, and he could see that it upset her to see them looking so jolly and carefree while she was in such trouble, and in public too. "Stand for his lordship, Justice Chilton," said the dog, and Mr. Butcher in armour clanked in with his helmet on and a judge's wig stuck on the top. He eased himself down into the chair and looked around him. The dog spoke up. "The case before us today, my lad, concerns the attempted theft of the priceless Indian statuette that you see before you. The accused are Sheba from the painting, the mummified pharaoh from the North Corridor, and Frank." "How do you plead?" said Mr. Butcher. "Not guilty," said Notsheba. "Not guilty," said Frank. Charlie remained silent. "How'd you plead?" said Mr. Butcher. Still Charlie remained silent. "I shall assume you plead guilty if you remain silent. For the last time, how'd you plead?" "I'm not a mummified pharaoh," said Charlie. "Well, what are you then?" said Mr. Butcher. Frank held his breath. Which of his many characters would Charlie choose? The mummified priest, Charlie Chaplin, the detective? There was a pause. "Who are you?" said Mr. Butcher. "Queen Victoria," said Charlie. Frank blinked. "And how do you plead?" said Mr. Butcher. "Not guilty," said Charlie. "Proceed," said Mr. Butcher. And the dog began. "The accused were apprehended by means of the closed-circuit TV system." Charlie interrupted, forgetting to sound like Queen Victoria. "Release the video. Get it into the stores. Let people hire it now." The dog ignored Charlie. On looking at the CCTV evidence, we became aware that Hanuman was being removed from his proper place by the three accused. When he entered the Indian room, they were holding Hanuman. To be precise, Frank was. Standing before you, my lad, are three wicked villains who don't care one jot for the beauty of the extraordinary value of this priceless statuette. Villains are prepared to wreck the wonderful Chiltern House collection for their own greedy ends. And the Chiltern House collection, let it be said, is not some small amateur assortment of curios. No, it's a glorious display of a great family's history, and recording its worldwide exploits, achievements and successes. The glorious array of beautiful works of art. All in all, Chiltern House and its collection is almost a history of Britain itself. And these villains were intent upon wrecking it. It's too horrible to contemplate. I call for the severest sentence. And the dog sat down. Master William and Miss Charlotte clapped frantically, followed by Mr. Butcher, the judge, who then stopped himself by shouting, "Order! Yeah, come on now, order!" "He'll never get the part," whispered Charlie in Frank's ear. "Throw him off the set, Frank." Frank was staring at the judge. Now he looked more like his teacher. "What do you say for yourselves?" said Mr. Butcher. "I'm not going to send letters home to your parents until I've heard your side of the story." Not Sheba spoke up. "This is all rubbish. How could you say we stole Hanuman? You stole Hanuman from a Portuguese ship 300 years ago." Hanuman shouted, "And the Portuguese stole it from Goa 30 years before that." "Order! Come on now, order!" shouted Mr. Butcher. "That's all history, nothing to do with what we're talking about, Frank." "We were just taking him back to India, sir," said Frank. "India?" said Mr. Butcher. "India? You're supposed to be, well, look, on the coach by 3:30. How are we going to get to India and back?" "Ah, India," said Charlie in his Queen Victoria voice. "I am the Empress of India." "Are you trying to say, in your own muddled, stupid way, Frank, you were taking Hanuman up to the Indian room?" said Mr. Butcher. Frank was really struggling to work out which Mr. Butcher this was, and it wasn't made any easier by the fact that his eyes seemed to be covered in some kind of film of water. "Yes, sir," said Frank. "What did we learn yesterday in assembly?" Frank recited. "No shouting, no running, no touching, no—" "Stop right there," said Mr. Butcher. "No touching. Whatever could have got into you to make you think that you could move the Chiltern House statues?" It wasn't my idea," said Frank. "It was his," he said, pointing to Hanuman. But the moment he said it, he felt terrible, telling on Hanuman like that. "So in the letter to your mother, Frank, I shall write, Frank didn't steal the statue. It was the statue's idea. Yeah, very believable, lad." "But it's true," shouted Hanuman. "Order! Order!" shouted Mr. Butcher. "And you, Sheba, I'm surprised. After all we've done for you, brought you here, given you a fine and beautiful house to grow up in, taught you the accomplishments of the English lady, yes, and you treat us like this." And under his breath, he whispered to the dog, "It's the savage coming out in her, you know." "I heard that," shouted Not Sheba. "Lady Chiltern might have taught me how to sew. The tutor might have taught me how to read and play that damn harpsichord. But no one has told me who I really am. You taught me all that so I could pretend to be somebody I wasn't. Not for my sake, for yours, so I could be a dainty little lady, but oh how sweet, black, a little black lady to put on show, a little black lady you made. But you can't make people like you can make a robot, like you can make Frankenstein's monster." Wow, thought Frank. She must have listened so hard to people's conversations over the years up on that painting. What kind of person would have walked around Chiltern House talking about Frankenstein? The mention of Frankenstein had an immediate effect on Charlie. He started grunting and swinging his arms to and fro. He grabbed hold of the table in front of him and started to smash it up. If only I had a bolt through my head, he whispered to Frank. Order, order, shouted Mr. Butcher. If you say anything else, Sheba, I shall cut your tongue out. More claps and cheers from William and Charlotte. Hooray! Oh! Not Sheba sucked her teeth at them. Right, said Mr. Butcher. I've heard enough. You are all three guilty. I will think for 3 seconds what the sentences will be. Frank, you will be transported to Australia for 10 years to serve hard labour for 5 of them. Sheesh, said Frank. Queen Victoria. We have reason to believe you are not Queen Victoria. As a mummified pharaoh, you'll be taken to Manchester University Archaeology Department for internal examination, and a TV programme will be made all about you called The Chiltern Mummy. I demand the right to choose the director of the movie. I want it down on the contract. You don't think Tom Cruise would sign away his body like this, do you? Silence! Shouted Mr. Butcher. But you, Sheba, will not have these privileges. You'll go back where you came from and never show your ungrateful face here again. Mr. Butcher got ready to go. Not Sheba shouted. But where do I come from? No one's ever told me. Mr. Butcher sat down again. He looked less like Frank's teacher at this moment. There was a long pause. Frank found himself holding his breath. He realised that he wanted to know the answer to Sheba's question too. This, Mr. Butcher began. Originally you came from somewhere in Africa, Sheba. I can't say as I know exactly because I bought you from a trader in Guinea. And he didn't tell me, and I didn't ask. You were taken to my plantation in Jamaica. But I saved your life, you know. Halfway across the Atlantic, when the seas were rough, we had to lighten our load, and I ordered some 20 or 30 fellow slaves to be thrown overboard. I caught sight of you and ordered the captain not to throw you too. Right, when we landed in Jamaica, I took you to my plantation, and again I helped you. Instead of working you in the fields, like the other slaves, I had you brought indoors to work in the house. And then, when I returned to England, I brought you with me. And that is saying something, my girl. I gave you all this. At this, Mr. Butcher waved his hand in the air and out towards the windows and the Chiltern House grounds. Not Sheba listened spellbound. But instead of answering the questions, it just made her ask more. But who was my mother? Where did I live? And what's my real name? Mr. Butcher got up to go. As I've said to you, these were not questions we asked the traders in the slave markets. I chose you for your bright eyes, good teeth and broad back. I thought you'd make a good worker one day. Not Sheba couldn't believe it. So near, and yet so far again. Charlie came over to her. You see, you could have come from Egypt after all. Egypt's in Africa. We might be relatives. For the very first time in all this, Frank had a feeling that Charlie might just be talking sense. Not Sheba waved him aside. She wasn't interested. Frank looked at her and could see that things were spinning round in her head. So, where are you sending me? Said Not Sheba to Mr. Butcher as he was leaving. Oh, Jamaica, of course. We don't send slaves back to Africa. And he left. The dog stepped forward with the soldiers and they got ready to march Frank, Not Sheba and Charlie off when suddenly there was a huge roar and a shout. And through the double doors and the windows came the corn dollies, the heads from the chapel, and carried high amongst them all, Pemulwuy. Thanks for watching, and I hope you enjoyed the story about Frank's adventures at the stately home. Maybe the next time you visit a museum or stately home, you'll be able to look at the objects on display there and wonder where they came from and what their story is. You might want to write your own story inspired by them. Frank also appears in You're Thinking About Donuts, which you can find here on Kids Poems and Stories with Michael Rosen. Don't forget to subscribe to this channel. Just click on the bell to keep updated with all the latest vids that we post here.